think I could speak for every Star Wars fan when I say the greatest moment in the entire series was in Episode 4, A New Hope. Luke Skywalker has just learned about his soon-to-be-fulfilled destiny as a Jedi, and embraced his Force powers. He agrees to help Obi-Wan save Princess Leia from the clutches of Darth Vader, and vows to take him down as revenge for killing his father. We then cut to Vader, who hears from one of his Imperial officers that there are rumors of a Jedi setting his sights on the Death Star's destruction. Vader turns to look into the vast space and says,
"I will not let you get away with this, Skywalker. My son."
Wait a minute, what? That didn't happen. At all! And okay, I'm not gonna do this bit for another 10 minutes. That didn't happen in Star Wars. Famously, the twist that reveals Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father is revealed towards the very end of the second movie in the original trilogy, The Empire Strikes Back. This pivotal twist has ingrained itself into the minds of so many people, whose entire worlds were rocked back in 1980. But let's pretend for 1 second. Let's pretend that this twist was indeed revealed in the very beginning of the first movie. What would happen? And not only that, but how in the world is this going to tie back into Kris somehow being the Knight? This is a Deltarune video after all. The Kris Knight theory is one of the most controversial theories in the Deltarune fanbase, and has been a hot topic of debate ever since Chapter 2 released. And today, I'd like to make the rare argument in favor of Kris being the Knight, both in terms of how it would affect the narrative, and in terms of the evidence we currently have. As it turns out, the topic of Kris being the Knight, or potentially not being the Knight, is a really large subject. My name is Spookydood, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I think this video would be best split into parts. Part 1. The evidence. Let's take a step back. Before I go back to that whole Star Wars question, I'd like to first talk about the Deltarune's fandom's beliefs when it comes to Kris being the Knight. See, this is one of the earliest Deltarune theories to come out of the woodworks, but it's also one of the first theories that the community has kind of universally debunked. Not to say nobody believes it, but across the wider Deltarune fanbase, I've seen most people brush it off. Let's quickly cover what even is the Kris Knight theory. Well, and stay with me here. The theory states that the Knight, the mysterious vigilante going around and opening up dark worlds, is none other than Kris. That's it. That's all there is to it. We don't really know the Knight's motives just yet, as it's implied there might be more to the story than just trying to cause the roaring, so figuring out who they are has been more a game of ruling people out based on physical evidence rather than actually trying to see who lines up with the Knight's characteristics. Even the Kris Knight theory itself isn't that insane, since it doesn't take into account what Kris's motives would even be if they were the Knight. The Knight as a character is still an enigma. Kris was the obvious first candidate to be the Knight, as we literally see them opening a dark world. However, as I said before, the community seems to have placed Kris in the very rare debunked as the Knight position. Kris is one of the only major characters who I've even seen get called outright debunked in many discussions I've had online. Even prominent Deltarune creators have made videos debunking the idea, which there's obviously nothing wrong with. However, I personally have to disagree. Let's get one thing clear. I am not necessarily claiming Kris is undoubtedly the Knight. However, my argument in terms of the evidence we're about to go over is that Kris can't be debunked just yet. Now, let's go through the supposed evidence that proves Kris isn't the Knight. 1. King and Queen both saw the Knight, but didn't respond to Kris or recognize them as the Knight. 2. Kris opening the Dark World isn't proof, as Chapter 2 showed any Lightener could do it. 3. Kris warns Undyne and the other kings about the Dark Worlds. 4. Toby's original plan for the intro. 5. The dreaded Kris Knight debunking timeline. I'll get to that. And 6. Why reveal the big twist less than a quarter of the way in? Those last two I'll spend a lot more time talking about. However, let's quickly go one by one, talking about why I think each argument is flawed. First off, King and Queen haven't actually seen the Knight. There's zero evidence to suggest King or Queen ever laid eyes on the Knight, especially Queen. Queen's entire plan was based on their assumptions about the Knight's goal. Even in the video in Queen's castle, it clarifies that you can't make out who the Knight is. King also believed the Knight's goal was to free the Darkeners to overthrow the Lighteners, which is a complete assumption and probably not what the Knight wanted. I think that there's an argument to be made that these scratches in the throne room are from King battling with the other kings, locking them up. But I think because, Toby did say the fountain corrupted King, so I think that there's a discussion here. On top of that, isn't it possible the Knight wore a disguise or armor of some sort? Either way, I don't think that King or Queen have seen the Knight. And even if they did, I still think that there would be reasons for them to not realize Kris is the Knight. The next piece of evidence is that Kris opening up the Dark World isn't proof, as Chapter 2 showed any Lightener can do it, and yes, but this works both ways. It's not proof that Kris Knight is debunked, but it's also not proof that Kris Knight is confirmed. It doesn't, this isn't really an evidence piece I feel like I have to argue. Either way, whether Kris is or isn't the Knight, there are reasons why they'd open this Dark World. The third piece of evidence is a bit harder to debunk, but I do have some thoughts. Kris warns the King and Undyne about their world being in danger, and of the imminent threat of dark fountains. Now, this is complicated, however, I think that there is a lot of potential points against this. First off, we've been controlling what Kris says. Now, I know we don't influence literally everything they say. They're able to say things, nuanced versions based on who they are as a person. However, whenever we're around, there's definitely a soft filter almost over what they're able to say and do. Even when Kris is speaking their mind, they're not fully able to say whatever they want. Look at the Spamton situation. I think that us initiating conversation with Undyne and the Kings is meant to be Kris saying what we think they'd logically say based on their status as the protagonist. You have to remember, for a casual player, there's a high likelihood they won't immediately figure out the importance of the separation between Kris and the soul. I didn't even get it until after Chapter 2. I always thought Kris was, possessed by Kara or something stupid. So the average player would expect this kind of dialogue when approaching adults in positions of high authority. The Kings are told that Kris's world is in danger, and Undyne is explicitly told of the danger of the Dark Fountains, and that people might fall in. This makes logical sense. If Kris was able to truly speak their minds, how come they didn't say anything about Snowgrave, or tell someone, hey, there's a soul in me controlling my every move? Even when Kris needs to speak most, after Spamton, they can't. They're reliant on our filter to get their feelings out. Not only that, but if Kris is nervous about the Dark Fountains, why go to the trouble of creating another one? I know the whole argument about Kris creating the fountain of Chapter 3 in order to alert Undyne and Toriel, but I don't know. Everyone who went inside previously thought it was a dream, Noelle and Berdly still believe it was a dream, and to create a fountain even after Snowgrave, there are better ways to alert people. Wake up Toriel and say, hey, look at that red soul on the couch that's possessing me and killed Berdly. That'd solve it. Otherwise, I don't think Kris warning others is definitive proof, as we have actions done by them that completely go against it. Actions that we can't currently explain. So, to summarize, I think that when Kris was telling Undyne and the Kings, it wasn't really Kris warning them, but instead us speaking through Kris. The next point is the legendary scrapped intro for Deltarune, in which the fun gang was going to be running up the stairs, only to see the Knight at the very top. This constantly gets thrown at me, but I don't feel like it's really good evidence. There are so many ways for Kris Knight to still work here. First off, maybe the Knight would be basked in light, so you can only see the shadow of them with a rim light around them. Maybe they'd be visibly obscured. Maybe they'd be in an armor. Maybe they'd just be Kris at the top of the steps. But wait, you ask, are there two Krises in this theoretical intro? And no, Kris and the Knight can both be the same person, and both be in the animated intro, as a form of artistic expression. It's a way of creatively portraying the split between Kris we play as and the Kris we don't play as. Or a stylized way of showing that Kris has an alter ego we aren't really privy to. Anime openings do this kind of thing all the time. This animated intro wouldn't have to be literal or in-universe, so who's to say Toby couldn't have pulled a fast one and used some artistic expression to have Kris and the Knight on the same screen. Okay, we're up to the dreaded timeline. Here's the thing, I'm not going to script this next bit. What I'm going to discuss now is the argument I see the most when it comes to debunking Kris Knight, and it surrounds the creation of Chapter 2's Dark World. It is a complex timeline showing Kris couldn't have made the Dark World for Chapter 2, and I think I can confidently debunk it. This is super complex and requires thinking a lot about the mechanics set up so far, so if you're not into that, here's some hyper-casual mobile game footage, and since I can't afford clips of young Sheldon, here's a still image. The main argument that goes into this timeline is that when we close the Chapter 2 Dark World, Noelle and Berdly close up their books. This implies that at some point they opened their books and began studying. The implication is that the Dark World must have opened after they started studying, because otherwise why would their books be open? The full proposed timeline goes like this. Kris and Susie meet Noelle at school. Noelle goes to the library with Berdly. After they open their books, the Knight, hiding in the closet, makes the Dark World, because remember, if the Knight was in the library, Noelle and Berdly would have seen them. And if they entered after Noelle and Birdley sat down, they still would have seen them, meaning the only logical option is that the knight was hiding in the closet. The knight quickly flees, leaving Noelle and Birdley to fall into the dark world. While hiding in the closet, they open the dark world. We arrive at the library and enter the cyber world. Rousey enters after noticing the dark presence, and upon closing the dark world, Noelle and Birdley close their books and leave. So just to recap one more time in case you missed it, we see Noelle at school, Noelle goes to the library, the knight's hiding in the closet, makes dark world, runs, Noelle and Birdley fall into dark world, we get there, chapter 2 adventure. When we wake up, Noelle and Birdley close their books because they had already started studying. Okay, you got that? Now here's my suggestion. Is it possible the dark world doesn't have to act in one specific way, and it was actually opened the night before? Is it possible that Noelle and Birdley's books were opened not because they started studying, but instead because Toby wanted Noelle and Birdley to reasonably believe they were dreaming? Now I know you're saying, Spookydood, you really think Toby would include random details that he hasn't entirely thought through? And yeah, I said in the past there's a ton of random little details that don't mean anything, but that's beyond the point. Before I debunk this timeline, I'd also like to point out that this supposed timeline is so insanely odd, and based on so many coincidences. Why would the knight be hiding in the closet? Were they specifically waiting for Noelle and Birdley to arrive? That must be the only answer, seeing that they have no problem creating the dark world once they're here. Not only that, but Noelle and Birdley completely missed the knight creating the fountain and running through the room? Some people use traffic jam as an excuse to explain how the knight managed to sneak away, but I feel like that'd have the opposite effect. The giant traffic jam stopped us from going anywhere. Wouldn't the knight be immediately seen and have a hard time escaping? Not only that, but Rousey only notices the dark presence after we leave the Castletown fountain. Are you saying that in the literal minute between us leaving the school and entering the library, all of this happened? It's just too coincidental. But that's all besides the point. That's just minor nitpicking. That's not evidence. Let's talk about that evidence. Let's talk about that timeline. There's a very specific detail in-game that seems to prove that this timeline can't be correct, and it's sweet Cap'n Cakes. Alright, this is the unscripted, kind of huge part. Try and stick with me here. Let's go over how time works in the Dark Worlds. In the Dark Worlds, time may run at any rate. It's unknown. It's also known that Dark Worlds exist prior to their fountains being opened. They speak about them, they have history, even if it is a case of last Thursdayism, which means that when you open the fountain, their histories are fake and created at that moment. Regardless, it doesn't matter. What we do know is that prior to being opened, a Dark World can go at any speed possible. However, once we enter the Dark World, time mostly runs parallel. In Chapter 1, it was we entered the Dark World and left, and it was a relatively believable amount of time that had passed. Same with Chapter 2. It's not like we entered there and left weeks later. We entered and left on the same day after spending a believable amount of time in the Dark Worlds. Essentially, if someone enters the Dark World, regardless of how time works, spending a week in there will be a hell of a lot more than 2 minutes long. Why is that important? I will tell you. To summarize my point, if you go into the Dark World and spend an hour in there, time is running parallel and it's pretty much been an hour that's passed in the Light World. This is, proven to be pretty true by Chapter 1 and 2. So, now let's go over something Sweet Cap'n Cakes say when asking them about the Queen. Queen wasn't always so harsh. No, she was. She just got worse somehow. It wasn't until that dark fountain showed up that she started going into overdrive. Night this, night that, fountain that. What does that night even have going for it that I don't? Now, how does that debunk the timeline? Well, this wording clearly shows it has been a little while since the fountain opened in the Cyberworld's time. They established that Queen has been noticeably different, and has spoken about the night and the fountain. That's not something that could happen in the span of 5 minutes, and it's probably not something that could happen in the span of a day, let alone a week. But hey, like I said, even once the fountain is open, time might still run very fast. The only time it runs parallel is when we're inside, as has already been established. So maybe once the fountain opened, since nobody was inside... Oh, wait a minute. But according to the timeline, Birdley and Noelle were there for the fountain's conception. Now are you starting to see it? If so much time has gone by that there's a notable shift in Queen's personality, Noelle and Birdley couldn't have been there the moment the fountain opened. Otherwise, they've been in there for a matter of a week, or maybe multiple weeks. meaning the fountain must have been opened prior to Berdly and Noelle entering the Dark World. My logical suggestion? The fountain was open early that morning, perhaps when Kris woke up past midnight and made their way to the library. The fountain was open, Kris fled, and then the events took place in the Dark World. Queen changed, the characters noticed, then Noelle and Berdly entered the library, falling into the Dark World. We followed suit, and then when we closed it, Noelle and Berdly woke up as if they had been studying, because it was the only logical way to convince them they were studying and fell asleep. So, there. I have thoroughly debunked this timeline, I think. As far as I'm aware, this dialogue by Sweet Cap and Cakes should serve as hard evidence against Noelle and Berdly being in the fountain from the very beginning. If you ask me what's more of an important detail, exposition about the history of this world that directly deals with how the fountain corrupted the Queen is far more important and takes precedent over a couple books. But does that mean the Dark World can reshape the world when it closes? Doesn't that mean these books are a plot hole? Now, I'd like to make a suggestion about this. In my last video, I talk about how so many things that are used as super duper hard evidence don't actually matter too much in my opinion. That argument definitely still applies here, but a lot of people got really mad at it. How dare I, in a field of evidence-based theories, suggest that hard physical evidence is nothing more than an afterthought? And I do get where you're coming from, I understand it. And so that's not the argument I'm going to use here. Perhaps the Dark Worlds don't actually have a hard set of rules. There's been so many times where it seems there isn't a hard rule set in place. We know the Dark Worlds exist without the fountains existing, as evidenced by, well, everything we've been told about them. We've been told by all the Darkeners that their worlds exist prior to the fountain opening, and by Spampton that we're going to meet Mike soon. And yet, after Chapter 1, when we ask Lancer about the castle in the Card Kingdom, he claims it's all gone, and Ralsei says they all turned back into objects. So which is it? Do the Dark Worlds exist? Do they not? Do the Darkeners think that they exist without the fountain being created? Or do they not think so? We've literally seen hard evidence for both. Maybe there just isn't a hard set of rules. All I'll say is this. It would take like 2 sentences to pretty much confirm Kris Knight. In Chapter 3, if some character says, the Knight created this world, blah blah blah, then that outright confirms it. And I think it would be awfully odd to have a Dark World completely detached from the Knight's will right when things are really picking up. I mean, that seems to go against logical story structure. Now, there's one more loose piece when it comes to this evidence, and that's Ralsei. He says he notices a dark presence only once we enter the Dark World, which to many people confirms that it just opened. I think this is false. There are so many potential explanations. First off, this is the biggest case of this detail probably doesn't matter that I've seen, but again, I'm willing to put that aside. Second, couldn't he have just noticed, or not noticed until we entered? Couldn't he have just, not realized it? Right? I mean, I don't think that's impossible. Maybe Ralsei knew about it, but was hiding it, ooh. Regardless, I don't think of any of this as hard evidence. I'd like to again reiterate my thoughts about how the Knight hides, waits for Noelle and Berdly for some reason, creates the huge dark fountain and runs out without being seen, also all in the minute between Castletown and the library, is far crazier than Ralsei didn't sense the fountain yet, at least in my opinion. I will give you that one as something that either just will be a plot hole or might, be evidence against it, I don't know. But wait, what about that last point? Why reveal the big twist less than a quarter of the way in? Doesn't that seem a bit odd to do? And with that, I'd like to segue into the next part of this video. Part 2. Plot twists. What's the point of a plot twist? What even is a plot twist? That's a question that has many answers depending on where you look. However, I think a good plot twist does 2 things, and this is my personal thoughts. 1, it adds context to the past, and 2, it adds context to the future. Now, obviously, certain twists will be so much more in-depth than that and will do more than that. However, if you look at most plot twists that are out there, especially the ones that aren't, plot-based, the turn is we just crashed on a new planet, but, the turn is, I was your father. It adds context to the past, and it adds context for the future. Look at the Star Wars twist, for example. Revealing that Darth Vader is the father of Luke Skywalker adds context to past events. Obi-Wan telling Luke his father was killed by Darth Vader is now recontextualized as Obi-Wan shielding Luke from the harsh truth. Luke Skywalker seeing himself in Vader during the cave scene now has the added layer of him being Darth Vader's son. Similarly, the twist has added context to our understanding of future events, as well as the events themselves. Now Luke's quest to defeat Darth Vader isn't as clear-cut as before. Now we wonder about how Vader became who he is, what future there is for him. When we watch Return of the Jedi and see Vader's attitude towards Luke, as well as his full turnaround into the eventual hero, the context of him being the father of Luke Skywalker has been added, and helps elevate the scene beyond Vader simply deciding to turn good. So hey, if Vader was such a good plot twist, maybe there's a perfect example of a bad plot twist I can provide. And yeah, there is, but it just so happens to be from the same series. In Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker, we found out Rey was actually a Palpatine. This held no Wait a minute, I'm just realizing, some of you might not know what that means. Emperor Palpatine was the villain of the original Star Wars trilogy, and in Episode 9 it was revealed that he returned with no explanation as to how, and we found out that the main character whose identity has been teased this whole trilogy is actually just a Palpatine descendant. They don't explain how he had children. Whatever. This held no narrative value, was not built up until this point, and while it could have worked to be honest, it only served as a diet, watered-down version of the Vader twist, in which the main drama from the twist is the fact that Palpatine tried to coax Rey to the dark side, which he would have done anyway. This didn't further Rey's arc, it twisted it into a shape that might resemble that of Luke Skywalker's, but falls into that uncanny valley of looking slightly off, leaving the viewers to question why it felt wrong. With the lack of build-up, lack of narrative value, and lack of proper explanation, this felt like a twist purely for the sake of shocking the audience. So back to that original question. What would happen if this twist was revealed in the very beginning of Star Wars? See, I think many times the concept of a plot twist, especially in the age of rapid-fire, quick attention-grabbing media, is taken as a chance to shock audiences without any reason. People see Game of Thrones and Five Nights at Freddy's and assume these plot twists are good because they're surprising, without understanding the proper narrative purpose behind hiding information and then revealing it at a proper moment. Despite this, sometimes the information would be more valuable if it was revealed sooner. If the Vader twist had been revealed earlier, I'd argue that there would be a significant narrative benefit. Or, I'd say there could be, I wouldn't say would. For example, a deeper look at the family dynamic between them, suspense the audience would feel waiting for the inevitable reveal to happen to the other characters, a more meaningful connection between the hero and villain from the first movie, most of which are definitely found on rewatches, for good or for bad. However, they could have been present from the beginning. Conversations that seem to mean nothing but basic exposition, generic warnings about turning evil, the rivalry between a hero who had no prior investment in this conflict, and a villain who's practically untouchable and has no reason to detest the random chosen one, could have all held so much more weight upon the first viewing. Now don't take this the wrong way, I'm not saying Star Wars should have revealed this twist sooner, I'm simply stating the potential benefits that could have come from it. Plot twists can be awesome. Revealing a truth that audiences didn't expect right towards the end could lead to legendary moments fans remember forever. But adding in twists for the sake of twists, hiding information simply to hide it, could lead to a narrative feeling watered down. Let's go back to that argument. The argument claiming that revealing the Knight's identity as Kris this early would be foolish, as the game's big mystery. I heavily disagree. I think there's an argument to be made that revealing Kris as the Knight this early majorly benefits the narrative, compared to keeping it a secret. That last argument against Kris being the Knight is that it feels wrong to reveal this game's big twist that early. However, that argument is under the assumption that the Knight is the big mystery Deltarune wants us to solve. Alright, let's solve it then. Let's pretend that Kris isn't the Knight, and that the timeline previously suggested that I attempted to debunk is actually the canon timeline. Let's use the information we know to deduce who the Knight is. Here's all the characters who could logically be the Knight. We'll treat this like a game of Guess Who. The Knight actively endangered kids at numerous times. Opening a dark world, and maybe two dark worlds, in the school, at the library, shows that they are willing to endanger kids. Add on to that the fact that the Knight waited in the closet, clearly aware that Noel and Berdly had entered. They are also willing to endanger them. Suddenly, 90% of our candidates are crossed off, unless someone is flat out lying with zero hints or build-up, which would be a really shitty twist. Then all of these characters are out. Not only that, but the knight fled after creating the cyber world, meaning their motives can have nothing to do with actually entering the fountains. They had the chance not to create it when hiding in the closet, but instead decided, no, I'll still make it, and fled the room, meaning they can't be characters like Knight Papyrus, who just wants to have a fun time. Similarly, this rules out characters who would be looking for Des in the Dark Worlds, and it also seems to rule out Des or Asriel, as neither of them would knowingly endanger Noelle, as far as we know. At this point, their motives must be either to cause the roaring, or to achieve some unknowable goal that involves luring specific Lighteners into specific Dark Worlds, which, based on what we know now, has zero precedent in reality. So not only are most of the characters eliminated, the remaining characters would have to want to destroy the world, which I think is kind of a shit motive for the Knight. I really cannot imagine a world in which the really interesting Knight character has the goal of wanting to destroy the world, especially since we'll probably redeem them rather fast, with the deeper conflicts of Gaster and the Titans on the horizon. And that's the other thing. Remember Asgore? Asgore is one of the most overlooked characters in Undertale. The entire game builds up to his eventual reveal, however when it comes it's quick, and our battle with him quickly gives way to much more interesting moments. Yes, Asgore is a well-loved character, but I can't help but feel like he's been given the short end of the stick by shoving him right at the end of the adventure, right before all the super duper meta cool awesome stuff. I really don't think it would be a good idea to do the same with the Knight, especially since there are so many deeper stories in Deltarune. Gaster, the Titans, the Roaring, the meta-narrative, which yes is important, and yes I'll make a 7-hour video on it, the weird route, the angel, the banishing of angels, heaven, Des, it all feels like, it feels like so much to just slap a Knight reveal right before. So why Kris, and why now? I've managed to talk about why it may be bad to hold off until the end, and yet I have yet to provide a single argument for revealing this specific twist right now, and for this twist to involve Kris. So let's do that. Part 3. Kris. The story of Deltarune so far is fascinating. Despite the generic fantasy plot of kids finding themselves in fantasy scenarios working their way towards saving the world, Deltarune has so much under the hood, and nuances in the characters, it seems like they'll eventually usurp the fantasy story as the more important plot thread. Gaster, Des, the connections to Undertale, there's so many elements that feel like they'll be the focus by the end of the game. And while there are so many plotlines to follow, I believe the heart of Deltarune, and the thing that will follow through until the very end, is the concept of us and Kris. Analyzing how we play games and how we insert ourselves onto characters. We don't know, and I want to add, also applying this to fiction and our escapism and that kind of thing. We don't know what the entirety of Deltarune is trying to say, however it has made a clear point to separate our actions from Kris, and really hammer that point home, hence why many people believe that control examined in the lens of us controlling Kris will be a core theme of the game. Kris being the Knight would allow for this theme to flourish beyond what we currently think it will. My suggestion here is that the end of Chapter 2 was the Knight reveal. Now we're faced with a problem. We, as the player, want to seal the fountains. We know about the Roaring. We believe our goal is to help save the world, however suddenly the character we've been playing as this entire time turns out to be the mysterious vigilante we've been chasing this entire time. This had such a unique layer of drama and intrigue. The one thing that always confused me when thinking about the main theme of us versus Kris was the fact that we didn't choose to possess Kris, and many of us are even trying to help them. How will the game address this? Are we flat out bad for possessing Kris? That would feel like such a stupid suggestion for the game to make, especially considering we didn't ask for this. Where will the conflict between us and Kris come from? I feel like that's clearly something that has to happen. I feel like the conflict between us is going to be emphasized. I don't feel like we're going to just completely get along, because what's the point of that? But how could we be the antagonistic force? I mean, we're good people. We'd like Kris. If Kris told us, hey, leave and quit the game, a lot of players probably would. So who's the antagonist in this scenario? And that gets answered very easily if Kris is the Knight. The main conflict between us isn't that we are the bad person for possessing Kris. We're playing the game as the antagonist, Kris, who works against us to undermine our goals. Now, yes, this raises a big red flag for many people. Yes, this would suggest that Kris would be the primary antagonist for at least a large chunk of the game, but I am not saying Kris would be evil. From a framing standpoint, look at how Toby Fox has portrayed Kris to a complete casual player who's completed Undertale. Kris acts odd, has obvious evil spooky Kara parallels. Kris opened the dark fountain creepily. Kris has red eyes and a knife. Clearly, Kris isn't a completely innocent teen who's seen or done nothing wrong. Clearly, there's a backstory to Kris that we don't know. Something they did, something they saw, something that happened to them. Maybe the bunker, Gaster, Des, something with Azrael. Who knows? But the point is that upon playing through the game for the first time, at the end of both chapters, I said, "Oh, so Kris is evil." Now, like I said, I don't actually think Kris is evil. But it's clear that Toby is currently framing it like Kris is someone we can't trust. Rather than a generic player bad for playing take, the conflict between us and Kris comes from us believing that we're in the right and that we're saving the world from Kris, who will eventually come to understand much more. This is lost on most hardcore fans and all of you who believe Kris is completely innocent, and I mean, even me, but if there was no Undertale, I think things would be very different. I think that we'd all believe Kris is the knight, and we'd be making theories like, what is Kris planning? But understanding Toby Fox and Undertale, and just that in general, has kind of led people to say like, oh no, I don't think they'd make, or Toby Fox would make Kris the knight. But if Kris was the knight, things would make much more sense, in my opinion. So where would this go? If Kris isn't evil, how will the game resolve us seeing Kris as the antagonist? Why is Kris doing what they're doing in the first place? Why are they doing this even after the weird route? Suddenly a lot more mysteries open up, and to be honest, that's where I'm the foggiest, although there is a good amount of evidence for one potential theory. Isn't it odd that we just so happened to get called to go get chalk? And how we just so happened to stumble into the library? And how Kris even suggests to go to the library right after Noelle leaves? And how Kris even plugs in the television between, can't even speak, chapters 1 and 2, preparing for that night. The line of dialogue when checking the sink even says, "It is not yet time to wash your hands." What I'm saying is, it seems like Kris planned for these specific adventures. The reason they've been spot on and planning for the future is because they already know what's going to happen. Perhaps they've even experienced it before. But why would they be doing this? Perhaps they aren't leading Susie into the Dark Worlds. They're leading us. After all, it's a common theory that Kris didn't randomly get us stuck inside them, but instead specifically summoned us. Usually people think via Gaster. And that brings me back to Gaster. Why would he insert us? Are Kris and Gaster working together? That's a good question. I don't think Kris is explicitly working with Gaster. That'd feel a bit silly. At least in my opinion. However, perhaps there's a deeper reason going on here. Kris is the knight. However, their motives for sneaking around and opening Dark Worlds are currently unknown. Observing the evidence we've put together so far, can we put together any theoretical suggestion about Kris's motives? Based on their actions, I'll make the guess that they know some information about the future. They are aware of our influence and are well aware that our personal actions will lean towards sealing the fountains, erasing their work. They are aware of the roaring and are aware that opening up enough fountains will cause the roaring, however choose to instead open fountains in nearby places that we always end up going to, rather than sneaking away and opening them up in faraway locations. It is arguable about whether or not they know about the secret bosses as well as Snowgrave. It seems to be the only few times they seem genuinely concerned by the events taking place. An argument can also be formed from them not knowing about Ralsei as well. Kris had some contact with the bunker, and it's highly illogical that we were accidentally inserted into Kris. So, what does that give us? I'm not going to pretend like I have the right answer. Regardless of whether Kris is or isn't the knight, the motives of the knight are impossible to figure out. But putting this evidence together, there is one theoretical answer. If you believe Kris knows something about the future, things begin to make some semblance of sense. Perhaps Kris is aware of the future. Maybe they've lived through it. Maybe their world has already gone through a reset. Regardless, if Kris truly did live through or witness the future or have some knowledge of the future, we have to ask what changed. What has caused them to do this specific journey? And there is one answer. Us. The future they saw or lived through or experienced or know about is different because now we're there. Therefore, the reason that Kris has been opening these specific Dark Worlds is to get us on this specific journey. They want something from us. They need us to do something inside the Dark Worlds, leading us to the big question, what? Well, considering they entered the bunker, I think the choices for what it is they're doing are very slim. We know they've dabbled in the occult. Who's to say they didn't summon Gaster, or just summon us? Perhaps the Deltarune world, as so many other people think, is indeed doomed, and Kris decides to use us, whether they were recommended to do so by Gaster or not, to save the world. Of course, then the question becomes, well, what do we have to do? And that I'm not able to answer. Maybe something as simple as banishing the Angel's Heaven, maybe gathering the Shadow Crystals, maybe doing the weird route. I don't know, and I don't feel like randomly guessing anymore. So to summarize, the reason I think Kris is the Knight is narratively sound. I claim that if Kris Knight is indeed canon, that reveal at the end of Chapter 2 was the actual reveal. That was meant to show us Kris is the Knight. Why? I think it happened to bring in conflict between us and Kris. So far, the only conflict was we are possessing Kris, which we didn't ask to do. Blaming us for it would be a huge case of how dare you play the game. So if we can't be bad, if we can't be the antagonistic force of this relationship, why not Kris? Them being revealed to be the antagonist we've been chasing this whole time brings up so many questions and immediately puts us against them. Maybe we think we're here to specifically stop them. Maybe we think Kris is evil, and they are the cause of the old future. In seriousness, if this was true, then the eventual reveal wouldn't be Kris isn't actually the Knight, but instead Kris isn't actually evil. There's another reason they've been doing this. Isn't it coincidental that they just so happened to be called to the closet? Wouldn't it have been odd if anyone else was called there? Ralsei certainly wouldn't make much sense then. Similarly, we just so happen to end up in the library the day there's a fountain? Doubtful, in my opinion. Look at it from a casual perspective. What have they seen? Kris holds a knife up, has glowy red eyes, slashed Toriel's tires, is said to be abnormal or creepy, literally opened a dark fountain, immediately tying them in with the Knight, and might I add, 99% of people believed Kris is the Knight after seeing that cutscene for the first time. Look up, like, all the gameplay videos on YouTube in which people say, oh, Kris was the Knight! I think that perhaps Toby is truly meaning for that to be the reveal, immediately creating conflict between us and Kris, while not stupidly veering into player bad territory. If Kris Knight was true, then the mystery isn't supposed to be a huge mystery. It was meant to be solved right then and there, after we had the proper build-up and understanding of the Deltarune world. After we had the proper build-up to believe Kris was trying to cause the roaring. So that's that. I want to reiterate something. I don't actually believe Kris is the Knight. I mean, I definitely think they could be, but I'm not fully sold on Kris. I'm simply arguing that it can't be debunked, and it also could be narratively satisfying and enjoyable. I think that there are definitely other options. All of my videos so far, I kind of do this thing where I make assumptions and like connect things logically, and then I just follow through with that. And I've seen a lot of people get annoyed. Like with my Gaster video, I talk about how certain things don't matter and are evidence pieces that you should throw away. And a lot of people took that like really to heart, and like I was trying to target them with that. And I'd never do that. I think the most important thing is making theories and having fun, you know? I think that personally, when it comes to canon, if you were to like give me $1 million if I could solve Deltarune, then my perspective is a lot of those things, a lot of those, as I called them in the last video, magic xylophones, are things that I would ignore. And if you paid me, I would not actually think, like, why are the books open? I would ignore that. Am I foolish for doing that? I mean, time will tell, but my point is, with these theories, there are always so many other options, and I am by no means, like, so attached to them that, like, I don't have, like, a Spookydood verse, you know what I mean? And there's nothing wrong if you do with, like, connected theories, but for me, my theories are kind of standalone. Angel's Hell was really fun and cool, and I still think it could happen, but it's not connected to this one. And, you know, even this one, there are points where I say, like, oh, Kris maybe saw the future. What if they didn't? Maybe it's a completely different thing. Some people say that Kris got us to just completely remove them from the life they had, which they were not happy with, which that also makes sense, you know? I have to say, sorry for the delay between releasing my last video and this one. These videos take so long to make, and I really enjoy them. I'll definitely be trying to upload much more, and I think I'm going to be uploading some non-Deltarune videos soon as well. Thanks so much for watching. If you disagree, feel free to tell me in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe and follow me on Twitter. I've noticed a large number of my viewers aren't subscribed, so if you subscribe, that would make me happy. My name is Spookydood, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.